introduced me to Roy because I was working on David Thompson at the time. And this is a map of the fur agent David Thompson's trade routes on the upper Columbia and middle Columbia River from 1807 to 1812. And he had these, he came across tribal trails across the Continental Divide that, you know, took him into the Rocky Mountain Trench and the Purcell Trench and went through the ice fields. And Roy started pointing these things out to me. And we realized that we could start leading trips that had both history and glaciology and geology in them. And then when we figured out that David Thompson's trips to the Pacific, he made it to the Pacific eventually and back, followed a lot of the flood coulees from the breakup. That's what we just like both ends of this idea. And Roy focused right at the intersection of the Cordilleran ice sheet and the floods. He spent his whole career at trying to figure out how the ice broke up, how the ice dam at Lake Pend Oreille broke up. Really simple stuff. And he began to show me really pretty maps. We both really liked maps. And this is Bretz's first great map. It's so beautiful because of the colors, and the blue is water from Glacial Lake Missoula, and the brown is the scablands, you know, the outflow of the Chinook Palouse, water flowing down and flowing all around. And keep your mind on the blue part of Glacial Lake Missoula. You can see Lake Pend Oreille right in the middle top of this slide, the little question mark shape. And that's where the dam was. And that's where I very often met him to go ride around and look at different features. But David Thompson did the same thing. Lake Pend Oreille, the question mark shaped lake in the lower center of your slide here, was where Thompson built his Kalispel house because he met Kalispel people there. And to do that, he came down a tribal trail that followed the Purcell Trench. I mean, this is all just, it's either Geology 101 or Tribal History 101, however you want to term it.
So I suppose you can go back and look sometime, somewhere.
And the details that Thompson put into his map, for instance, the Clark Fork Delta on the right side of the lake, are just so fine and clear that they are actually telling us what the world was like 200 years ago. Roy is trying to tell us what the world is like 20,000 years ago and 13,000 years ago. And a great way to relate to kids, I teach a lot of kids. Roy taught at the University of Idaho, taught a lot of adults, young kids and adults. They often have trouble with this idea of deep time, and 200 years at a time is something that they can begin with to get up into the thousands before you start going back into the millions. My wife Claire and I systematically looked up all of the artwork before 1860 that related to David Thompson. Roy showed me how it related to the floods. And we did some of the most fun presentations in various venues, like bars in Idaho, where people would get into fistfights about where the artist was standing when they made this painting, that kind of thing. It was just so amazing. If you've ever been to Bonners Ferry, Idaho, and you start driving to Sandpoint, you come up a hill. There's actually a couple interpretive signs there, one of which talks about Thompson. And you look down into the valley. This is the Kootenai River flowing north to Creston, BC. And there's a golf course there, and there's a little lake on the golf course. And that's the remnants of Paddler's Lake. James Madison Alden was a young painter with the Boundary Survey in 1860 who painted exactly what Thompson saw as he paddled up to Kootenai Lake from Bonners Ferry with the Kootenai Guide in 1808. And 9, he did it again. And here you can see why he had to have a guide. This is it's a river that hasn't been channelized, which is hard to come by in the West these days. And it just went all over the place with different channels each year, year by year. And what's driving it is this glacial lake, which we know is Kootenai Lake today, that's drying up and leaving this in its wake so that the river flows north, as many of the rivers in North Idaho and Eastern Washington do. And that's just, you know, a glaciologist's dream to get to see these as they were and to understand what it's like to dry up behind a glacier that's retreating. Today, we get to see that in spades in any glacier in the world. Again, here's Thompson's map of the lake, and he's heading, when you look at this, and he comes in on this road on the northwest side of the lake, and then Kootenai and Salish guides take him to the east side of the lake at the Clark Fork Delta, where they want him to build a trade house. And this painter Alden, any of the early fur people did, or anybody that visited the region that's white for the next half century, all they did was follow the routes that Thompson pioneered from tribal trails. So here's Alden coming in on the lake and looking east at what was Cullyspell House and Antelope Mountain, which is a famous place where the glacial ice hung, and you can really see a hanging valley there. And there's a nice Kalispell canoe in the middle of the picture. Roy goes crazy at these things because they're astonishingly accurate, and they really describe how suppression of fire, for instance, has altered the landscape in the intervening 200 years. Now you go and there's just timber all the way up to the tops of these mountains. Here, because of tribal burning and let it burn kind of policy that the tribes had, there's just a very different look. Here we're looking southeast at the Green Monarchs, where the Cordillera and ice sheet stopped and backed up to form Lake Missoula. And here's one of Roy's aerial pictures of it. It's looking more to the south, but you can see Bernard Peak to the east there on the left side. The snow-covered peak to the right is Mount Spokane. The other one that's not quite snow-covered is Mica Peak, just south of the city. And this is where the waters drained, where the majority of the waters came out from the floods. I also studied a man named John Lieberg, who we talked about a couple times ago, and his homestead was right in the middle of this on what is now Farragut State Park, where the U.S. Navy had their facility during World War II, which is also a story that plays into Roy's whole world, really. Here we are looking straight east with Alden, looking straight across at the Green Monarchs, and here's Roy's aerial photo of how amazing they are, how truly amazing they are, and how you can see how the Cordillera ice sheet might get hung up on them and come exactly to the top of the scrapes there. And you can really get an idea of what all this looked at. There's no place. There's a lot of places to look at Ice Age flood features, but to look at ice features, there's no place that really lays it out more than the Green Monarchs. And if you look behind them at the snow-covered peak on the left of the slide, that is Pack Saddle Peak. So from you can see by the snow, the Pack Saddle Peak is several hundred feet higher than any of the other peaks around this part of the Coeur d'Alene range. And you can get up there and look south and see the Lieberg homestead and see the outflow of the floods in just dramatic fashion. So here's David Thompson's map again. You can see Lake Pend Oreille at the top. And if you go off to the east and south, you're just following Harlan Bretz's blue on his map that shows the extent of Glacial Lake Missoula. These little bicycle chain features that Thompson draws in, all they're doing is dividing drainages. That's how that was a standard map making method to show where the water flows. Thompson was just a terrific map maker, but he never went up in the mountains. He was a fur trade guy on the rivers all the time, but he was great at getting the contours of the divide and then showing it. And if you're water, that's where the Lake Missoula Lake flood waters started out and basically backed up all the way to the Bitterroot at the very lower right corner of this slide. The yellow line is Thompson nodding to Lewis and Clark. That's where they went in the Bitterroot and came across Lolo Pass and came out at the Clearwater and the Snake, totally lost and bumbling around the whole time. And that's his nod to their amazing efforts. But he also, and John Lieberg also figured out that Lake Missoula went all the way down the Bitterroot because as you can see on Thompson's map, there's no divide to keep them from doing that, and water finds its level. So Roy and I, and Roy with a lot of other people, took many trips stopping at gravel pits along this route so they could look at rhythmites and lake levels and figure it all out and do all these great demonstrations. And it was so much fun. It's the same fun that you guys all have when you go out on these trips with really good interpreters that can show you how it worked. And nothing shows you how it worked like a gravel pit. Roy and I drove all over North Idaho looking at gravel pits. And this is a particularly good one on the Clark Fork. And as you go on up the Clark Fork, this is Thompson's map showing what he called the horse plains and the Itowoy plains. Itowoy is the Salish word for camas. To the left, where OBS is on the very left side, that's an observation, a surveying observation. That's where he built his Salish house at the falls there, at Thompson Falls, Montana today. And then on the Itowoy plains, that's what we call Camas Prairie today. There's an artist named Gustavus Sohan that came in the 1850s for the railroad survey and I'm sure he did a beautiful painting of it, but it's lost. And then it appeared in the railroad survey report as a lithograph. So Roy and I spent quite a while looking at this going, how could an artist like Sohan, who is fantastic on details in other lithographs, but especially in his original art, how could he miss the ripple marks that you see if you get the light right and get up above Camas Prairie today? It's one of the most famous sites for seeing, and where the giant ripple marks were really codified, I think. But art isn't always perfect. You know, geology isn't always perfect. There's always some little piece of the story that falls away, and then it comes back. Like when you go there in the afternoon light is perfect, and you can understand suddenly what's going on. Here is Thompson's map all the way from Lake Pend Oreille on the upper left to Salish Lake on the right. That is Flathead Lake, because Flathead people speak Salish language. The same families go from Flathead Lake to Kalispell Lake all the way to the Columbia. And so it's all the Salish River to him. We call that river 3 different names now, but it's clear that it should be just one name because drainages are how this works. But we can't deal with that. He takes down this name in the center, lower center of the slide called Missoula Taka River. That's the first sign we have of Missoula. So, you know, sort of the bastardization that has become Missoula today from Salish language. Thompson really liked this Salish house. He really got along with Salish people. He developed relationships with several of the elders. He spent 2 winters at Salish House at Thompson Falls. He recorded many stories and observation from around there. And they took him to visit Flathead Lake. And he went up there through the Mission Valley and painted the Mission Mountains, which a lot of you have probably seen, south of the lake. This is Salish Mountains south of the lake. And it's the missions. And there's a great high school science teacher named Norm Jacobson from Lobe who does a talk. There's several of these watercolors that Thompson did. We got the originals for a museum exhibit we did for Thompson some years ago, and Norm put them all together and does a talk and explains why Thompson missed this or missed that, and how it all connects up and how they've changed. But showing them to Roy Breckenridge was a totally different experience. He looks at this, and I look at it and see a trail to the Blackfeet where they hunt buffalo. I see Kootenai country on the left and some tribal division territorial lines. I see a brook coming off of Mount McDonald. Roy Breckenridge looks at it and sees the level of Glacial Lake Missoula. He sees geologic features coming off the mountains. He sees the extent of the ice when the glaciers ran a lot further down back in the day. Again, we know the date of this. This is March 1st, 1812. So we know the exact date this was painted, and you can go. It's amazingly fun to go to this site on March 1st in a year and just see how much further the forest has encroached on the altitude of this range and how much less ice there is. we've seen a lot of changes just in these last 200 years. But again, if you're thinking about ice age floods and changing it to the thousands of years, there's been really much more cataclysmic changes over that time. And Roy can address those. So now we're going to come south towards Spokane from Lake Pend Oreille. This is what Thompson called the Skeechew Road. Skeechew is the Kalispel word for Coeur d'Alene. So there's the Coeur d'Alene Lake and the Coeur d'Alene tribe down here. And you can see that the road follows the very tail end of the Purcell Trench, as Roy pointed out to me, and then swings across Rathdrum Prairie into Spokane. And this guy, James Madison Alden, did a painting of that. And you can see the ripple marks. You can see what the riparian looked like along the Spokane River 150 years ago. This is 1860, this painting. And again, this is the flood path where there was no shrub steppe. It was all grassland prairie, like the Horse Plains or Camas Prairie in Montana. Roy, we spent a lot of time inside this picture and going back and forth, because this is where Roy grew up. This is the Arborcrest Winery in Spokane. If you look to the right, that rock, you can actually stand on that rock if you're at the Arborcrest Winery drinking. And that's Coyote Rocks in the river below. And that's Plants Ferry, the old ferry crossing. That is where Roy grew up in the Spokane Valley. So this was a particular place for him, and I always associate them back and forth. As you come to the lower right, there's some old belt rock that the floodwaters cut differently than it did the basalt. So Roy could get into the geology even as a kid. So here's David Thompson's map for the region around Spokane. Spokane House, his fur trade post that he built, is 9 miles south of the present city. So right at the present city where it curves north, where the river curves north, just a little east of there, that's where Spokane Falls are today. And this is what really started, where Roy really started getting away with me. Those two dotted lines are tribal trails. Thompson took the lower one because the tribes told him to go that way. The upper one is a quicker way to get to 9 Mile Falls because it cuts the hypotenuse of the triangle. And it's also the former course of the Spokane River altered by the Ice Age floods. So Roy points that out to me, and then he didn't get technical very often, but he showed me this USGS profile. On the left is the Spokane River running. In the middle is this plug of basalt that the floods water spared. And to the right is the former course of the Spokane River filled up with gravels from the flood. And it is also the Spokane Aquifer, and it's filled up with all these amazing aquifer features, hydrologic features, which is why the USGS had to do a profile of it. David Thompson walked down the right side along the Spokane River on this tribal trail and noted 5 Mile Prairie, which from the air looks like a big plug in the middle of all this. It's not that huge, but it's very distinct. On the right side, it's very different. And you can see, and this again, Roy was really a historian of the flood in a lot of the ways. And he described this history teacher, science teacher at Lewis and Clark High School in Spokane in the 19-teens and 20s, who had a group of buddies and they got interested in all this. This was just before Brett's got going and then after Brett's got going. When Brett's came to Spokane in the early 20s, Thomas Largey loaned him a car and also drove him around and showed him some of the features that they had been studying. In their mind, the extent of the ice was much further south than we think it is or know it is now, depending on what you think of science. And you can see it coming down into Spokane and south of town there. If you look to the right, on the left side, upper side, there's a little plug that says 5 Mile Prairie on it. That's the prairie we're talking about. And Larget's blue marks are showing different, what to him were different extents of ice that carved it in certain ways. They are really hard to figure out. And Roy was a great proponent of saying, you know, it's not easy to tell flood features from ice features often, especially if you don't have a lot of context about what's going on, especially if you don't know where the glaciers lay and where the moraines are. So we went to the back side of 5 Mile Prairie. You can see the Little Spokane River running in there. And it's in this huge wide valley because it used to be the Big Spokane River. And on the hillside where it's cut down, there are these remarkable springs. I mean, just gushing out of the hillside in different places, dozens of them. And they were the source of a modern fish hatchery, 2 different fish hatcheries, a giant dairy farm. They're the source of all these things for white history in Spokane. But for tribal people, they remember up above this flowing water, they made a refrigeration effect inside of 5 Mile Prairie. And there were these remarkable ice caves right at the base of the north side. The Little Spokane, the Ice Age floods left perfect size gravel for steelhead reds. And the Little Spokane was famous for its steelhead runs. And they would fish for steelhead, catch a bunch, and then take them up and store them in these ice caves. They're really well known to the tribal people. And so I was doing some research and stumbled on some early newspaper articles about them that I don't know what to say. This was a family that homesteaded on the north side. They found these ice caves and dug an old-fashioned storm cellar down into one of them. You can see that at the bottom. There were several caves around that you could walk into. You can see a guy and his wife on the right with a thermometer that shows it's like July and it's 98 outside and it's 34 inside the ice cave. And they would store their fruit and potatoes and such in there. They went down into the cellar and that's where they put their meat because it always had ice on the bottom of it. But in this newspaper article from the 1929 spokesman, the gentleman feeding his dog ice there described finding a tule mat on the bottom of it when he first improved it. And that drives archaeologists and tribal people out of their minds thinking like, what was this? How was it used? How long was it used? Why isn't it a national monument or something? I mean, it's a really important place. It's on private property now. So in a lot of ways, it's lost, but in a lot of ways, having it on private property keeps it because it's incredibly cut up rock. And Roy and I went there, me asking him to tell me that it was a flood feature and him saying, man, this is it's so cut up. I can see why Larget and his teaching friends thought it was an ice feature, thought it was ice damage on it, because it's just so carved into all kinds of bits. But you can still see caves. Kids go up there and still play in them. On a day in April or May, when it's a year like this and there's a lot of snow and snow melt, you can go up and there'll be these ice windows covering the entrance to the cave, like a glass door. They're just astonishing. And you can see how it's a curiosity for white people now, but in previous generations, it was a place to store your produce and your meat. But in previous generation, again, in the thousands of year old time frame, it was a necessity. You had to have a place to keep your fish, to keep your roots, so that you could live on them all winter. You could not let them get hot and moldy, warm and moldy. Then this ice was just the right temperature. This was a magic, important place. And it was created by the floods. And again, I don't see how you can talk about the floods without going backwards in time to the Pleistocene and to the Miocene and talk about basalt flows, but also forward in time and talk about the tribes and the early white settlers who are finding some of these things out, and the early people besides Harlan Bretz, like John Lieberg and Thomas Larget, who were just regular folks living on the landscape, but had a sense of place and were good at observing what was around them and would say, wow, this is a water feature we're looking at here. This was a lake. This is ice. There's something going on with the movement here. Brett's was at the right place in the right time with an incredible bulldog intellect that we all hear about to codify all this, to run the numbers on it and get it so that he could make his beautiful map. But people living in that map, tribal or perceptive white people, they understood it already. And they were seeing it in a different way and getting different benefits from it. But they were inside it in the way that we want to be inside it when we go on one of our bus rides and see the work of the floods. So here's where this is some of the stuff you guys are going to see when you go to Sun Lakes, but it's just to the east of it. When the water blew out and came through that area of Spokane, then it comes down and forms the Cheney-Palouse scablands. And as you can see, we're on Thompson's map again. You can see on the lower left-hand side of the map, the Snake River flowing into the Columbia. That's the confluence at Pasco on the lower left. Then that's the Palouse River flowing in on the middle left in the center of it. That's the Palouse River coming in. The tribes that live down there, the Palouse, Walla Walla, Wanapum, Cayuse, Nez Perce speak Sahaptin family languages. We're no longer in Salish country, we're in Sahaptin country. So David Thompson names this trail, the Shawpitin is what he called it, Shawpitin Palouse Road. And when he came back from the Pacific, rather than go all the way around Big Bend in a canoe paddling against the current, he traded he stashed his canoe, gave some Palouse tribal people an IOU for horses, and followed the flood channels back northeast on a northeast slant, just following the flood. These are all tribal trails, of course, to get back to Spokane House. Again, it is not rocket science. It's where the landscape leads you and how the tribes had learned to negotiate it. And the key is what plant grows where, where's a spring, where can I meet relatives, where are roots I can dig. And they have encyclopedic knowledge of that along the trail. They just show Thompson how to do it. And here's James Madison Alden, the boundary survey painter, painting one of these. Again, we're going north, just like Thompson did. So we're looking north up this flood coulee. You can clearly see all the flood features. And you can see how the water would be coming right at you and hitting this plug in the middle and leaving this gravel bar on the back side of it, right? That's how it works. But if you're a tribal person, you get a gravel bar like that. That's what biscuit roots. There's many kinds of biscuit roots, and they're very important root food for the tribes. And that's the kind of place that the roots love, the biscuit roots love, the mush, if you're Sahaptin. Then to the middle right, there's the camp where the boundary survey people camp. The name of this is Aspen Camp. You can see the grove of aspen, and it's all wet down there in the open. That's where the camas grew. So at a different time of year, you go there and gather camas roots, dig camas roots. So there's a great story from the boundary survey of people getting sick up on the border and having all the kinds of signs that people on ships had at that time, their teeth falling out, the no energy, they get really languid. It's scurvy. And that there's tribal people up there go, well, what's the problem? Just go get some roots and we'll fix you up. And so a contingent goes down. Alden is with them. They go get a bunch of roots. It's the right time for digging camas, not biscuit roots. They get camas, and it has the nutritional profile to beat the scurvy. Everybody gets better. This is amazing stuff. And what's really amazing is that this coulee looks exactly like it does in this painting. It's on the Harder Ranch, just south of Sprague Lake, not too far east of where you're going to go for your Sun Lakes trip. It's on private land, so you can't just go to it like you can Sun Lakes. That's the only difference in a lot of ways. It's a spectacular coulee. So then if you follow the Palouse River on down, this is a walk that some of you may have taken for an Ice Age floods trip, in fact, where you go to the mouth of the Palouse River with Gene Keever or Bruce Bjornstead and walk up to Palouse Falls. This is a place Roy and I went called Upper Palouse Falls, which is on, you have to cross private land to get to it. But again, it's a family that you can get to know if you live there. And this is the Upper Palouse Falls by a painter named Paul Kane in 1847 in the late summer. Here's a photograph of the falls looking exactly the same on a 10 degree below zero day in January a few years ago. Everything is the same, including the vegetation, except for cheatgrass. There's a lot less sand visible, fine soils. There's a lot more cheatgrass that has come in and established itself around the hills. Other than that, it's the same deal. Kane liked it so much that he painted a second painting of it from a different direction. This is where the Ice Age floods. Again, it's a really famous place in the story where the Palouse River comes down and takes a direct 90-degree dogleg. It's flowing east and it just turns south. And it's quite amazing. And you can see it from the falls. Here's Kane's painting, where you can see this rock, say, on the lower left. And here it is again with the rock being slightly covered with water and some of the same vegetation. And there's the river taking off south. 8 miles further south, you get to Palouse Falls, which is, the big tourist attraction for the Ice Age floods. And here's Kane painting it. And when Roy looks at this, he sees the different flows of basalt from the Miocene and how Kane, really better than any of the other artists, saw, he just painted what he saw, and that gives him all the words from basalt layered flows that you need to weather them out and describe them geologically and have the floods then be able to carve at them, do a back channel like this and create this huge falls. Beautiful, beautiful watercolor. He does an oil of this painting after he gets back to his home in Toronto and totally screws it up. It's nowhere near as geologically valuable or botanically valuable or historically valuable as this watercolor that he did in the field. And I think that's often true. You can read 100 books about the Ice Age floods, but it's not happening until you go see them, as you know, as you guys know better than anything. So Roy and I would go take these trips and often have, people around to do the interpretation, this sort of combination of history and geology. But his place was Lake Pend Oreille, and his work, his scientific work, involved thinking about the ice and visualizing and then reconciling in an engineer's sense how this incredible ice dam came apart, at what rate, and how the water flowed out, which is unbelievably complicated. This is the Clark Fork Delta, where the Clark Fork enters Lake Pend Oreille. The Corps of Engineers did a ton of work on it, but now they're trying to the state parks is trying to restore it to more what Thompson saw. If you look at in the left center of the picture, there's what looks like an island. It's a peninsula where Thompson's Cullyspell House is, and on the right of that is a slough called Denton Slough. When Thompson was there, it was a meadows called Indian Meadows until Albany Falls Dam went in. And that's what Roy is really after, is how did the ice come in on this delta and work. And here's a picture of Roy on one of our boat interpreter trips trying to make it work with his arm to describe what's going what way. And here's the wonderful mountains of Lightning Creek and Mosquito Creek up over it with just a little snow on them. And Roy would go to great lengths to try to verify his ideas. The fjords, there's been a lot of work done on the fjords in Scandinavia about how ice moves up and down them more recently so that you can work on it. And even more recently in Argentina, there's been a lot of work. And Roy became fascinated with the ice that was coming out in Argentina and Chile, in Chile, where you could see the wall and see it falling apart and see how the water acted under it, coming down from similar sized mountains. That's the great thing about this photograph, is you can see this is the southern edge of the Andes, but it doesn't look that much different than the mountains above Lake Pend Oreille. So we're looking at those mountains just at the far horizon of this painting. At the near horizon, at the near bottom side, we're looking at the marina at Bayview. To the right is Farragut State Park, where John and Carrie Lieberg homesteaded. To the left is Cape Horn, which is an amazing ice feature, which held the ice. And again, to the right in the middle is the Green Monarchs and Bernard Peak, which held the ice. And it doesn't seem fair that Roy gets this incredible break, but to the right in the middle there is the U.S. naval installation where they do things in the lake. In World War II, they did a submarine training facility in the lake because it's the deepest lake in Idaho and it was way out of the way. And there was no way for anyone to get in there and, spy on them or anything. And they did some amazing stuff. And they kept the facility after the war ended. And they gave Farragut to the state parks, where Roy had a couple of really fantastic geology conferences. But they kept the facility with ships in it, often scale models of real submarines and destroyers and stuff, and did sonar work on the lake. And boy, did Roy's ears perk up when he heard that. Because again, Lake Pend Oreille is the deepest lake in Idaho, right? But how deep is the lake? What's on the bottom of the lake? How much of it, everywhere else that we've been talking about in Spokane, there's all these sediments left over from the Ice Age floods. How do you factor them in? And here's one of the vessels looking back at Cape Horn. You can see where the ice hung on the hills there. How did it come loose? And what happened to the bottom of the lake? Where is the bottom of the lake? What does the sonar show? And Roy started talking to the naval people. They're reticent because these show what their technology can do, right? So they showed him this picture of their sonar, and they can describe 3 different qualities of the sound bouncing off the bottom. And they determined, and Roy confirmed, that this is 3 different kinds of sediment, sizes of sediment, that they had not found the bottom of the lake yet. This does not show the bottom of the lake. They didn't want to show them anymore. The Navy didn't. Roy did a Freedom of Information Act request, got to be friends with some of the people that he was dealing with, and he got this picture, which is quite different. And I have put down some of the figures that this shows in the top of the slide. You can look at the bottom of the slide and see the bedrock and see the sediments and realize that the sediments are just the beginning of the story. Levels 1 and 2 are just nothing. Level 3 is the big one. So the surface level of Lake Pend Oreille at full pool behind Albany Falls Dam is 2,050 feet. In the south end of the lake, near Bayview, in fact, just off from the Green Monarchs and Bernard Peak, it's 1,150 feet deep. It's the deepest lake in Idaho. So the top sediment, right where you see the line that says stratified sediments, that is 900 feet above sea level. It's 1,150 feet below the surface of the lake. This is confusing because the bedrock basin at the bottom is 700 feet below sea level. And if you do the numbers there, the sediments are 1,600 feet thick. So the sediments at the bottom of the lake are thicker than the water in the lake. That's one thing to boggle your mind. But much more than that is that they are below sea level. What Roy was able to, and what he knew already, was that in the fjords of Norway, they'd done a lot of work and figured out that the only thing that can grind away bedrock to below sea level is ice. That's the only thing powerful enough to do it. So we talk about the amazing power of the Ice Age floods in a water sense, but water could not have ground out, carved out this trough for Lake Pend Oreille quite this deep. So what we're looking at is the work of ice and then the floods coming in and filling up this amazing trough. There's similar features at Lake Chelan in Washington, but it's not as deep, but it's still spectacular. And some of the basic geology of all this was done there. Roy could go to school on the Scandinavian work and the Chelan work. And what the Navy has, nobody has sonic information like this except the U.S. Navy for Lake Pend Oreille. So this is a very important paper. I'm not a academic, so I don't know whether this is the most important paper Roy ever wrote, but it's the most amazing one to me. And it's hard to get on a boat and go out in the south part of Lake Pend Oreille and say, man, we're 1,000 feet above the bottom here, but we're 2,700 feet above the real bottom. It's just hard to get your mind around, and it's below sea level. It's just, the floods have so many things that are so hard to get your mind around. Time is hard to get your mind around. Everybody understands that. The Miocene being 17 million and the floods being 17,000, we can't, it's hard to make that leap in human minds. But to make a leap between 600 feet above sea level and 700 feet below sea level, you can start doing that if you have a sandbox out back and start playing in it. And again, this is one of the reasons I love Roy, I guess. So he would do the fine details of these. He had a great map collaborator named Dean Garwood, and they worked for the USGS at the University of Idaho. Roy was the state geologist of Idaho for years, and they had an office up there that allowed him to teach it, but mostly do research and he and Dean would come up with maps like this that just had the latest, most finely detailed information about how the flood worked around Lake Pend Oreille, around Kalispell Lake, around Kalispell House, and Indian Meadows, and all these places that David Thompson describes so clearly. Roy explains how the floods shaped it out so that he could move through it with tribal fluidity after he hung around there with the tribes for several years, and what the tribes might have been doing for several thousands of years around this lake. So again, anybody who wants any of these images, I'm very happy to email you a JPEG of them. And as Dale said, this whole talk is on a YouTube channel later, but I just want you to know that this is Pack Saddle Peak where the snow was. That's Bernard Peak with this really distinct avalanche Y on it on the left. That's where the floods came out in the Leeburg Homestead, looking down at that forked bottom. It's hard to get up there for me now and not think, wow, these trees are so much higher than they were. John Leeburg collected all these alpine plants, and there's no alpine left here. Nobody understood anything about the floods, but look at them. They're just so apparent. And there's a 360-degree view from here, and you can turn around this way and see huge swaths of Lake Missoula. It's just a really good place to get a feel for what the floods were like and what David Thompson and John Leeburg were doing in their time, but especially what Roy Breckenridge was doing in his time, and what a terrific job he did of it. We are all very proud of him and can't thank him enough. Thanks a lot for letting me tell you that.